Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of History Bites, True Crime and the Murder of Helen Jewett. The more things change, the more they stay the same. In this episode, I'm going to be looking more broadly at a historical event and explaining how it is still extraordinarily relevant to modern popular culture, even though it is separated from us by nearly 200 years at this point. Since the advent of the internet, most of our exposure to true crime has been through podcasts, YouTube, or broadcast news. And of course, in the 1800s, they didn't have any of that. So, they got all of their true crime through newspapers. You see, newspapers were almost ubiquitous in pretty much all of the major American cities. For example, New York had a large amount of what we call penny papers, so cheap, almost daily, sometimes every other day newspapers, or larger broadsides. But either way, if you got your newspaper every day, or if you got it once a week, they were the cornerstone of news distribution. And not only that, but they were so ubiquitous that I think calling them anything other than popular culture would be doing a disservice to the importance they had on, well, American culture as a whole at the time. Without the newspapers, news would have traveled significantly more slowly, and, well, people would have just generally been worse informed. Newspapers not only were influenced by their audience, but also, of course, exerted a great deal of influence over their audience by nature of being their main source of news. This is an effect we can still see today, where, depending on a person's source of the news, well, their outlook on the world is quite different, to say the least. The murder of Helen Jewett is an example of crime reporting that became a national sensation. The whole situation is very reminiscent of modern-day true crime, especially things like true crime podcasts or YouTube channels, or even some actual official news coverage. While nowadays most people don't get their true crime information from newspapers, well, that was almost the exclusive source of true crime knowledge to people in the early 1800s. Of course, now you might be asking yourself, who is Helen Jewett, and how is she relevant to true crime? Well, she was a prostitute in 1830s New York City, and as you might have guessed by the title of this podcast, she was murdered. The whole case surrounding her murder became a huge nationwide sensation, an example of a real-life murder mystery. As a quick digression, the primary subject I'm trying to cover in this podcast is the reporting on Helen Jewett's murder, but if you want more details on the murder itself, I highly recommend a book called The Murder of Helen Jewett by Patricia Cline Cohen. It is the primary source for this podcast and is also a very interesting read. Anyways, back to the subject at hand. From essentially hours after her death through the end of the trial, reporters hounded everyone involved for as much information as they could. It was even one of the first examples of reporters actually going to a crime scene themselves to discover details on their own. The initial interest of the reporters gathering their information from the scene and from, well, people directly involved created a new sort of sensation amongst the readers of the papers these reporters published for. Because now the public also got to read in detail all of the events, all of the details, all of the little key hints that might let them piece together what happened. The attention of all of the readers of these papers created a sort of feedback loop with the reporters themselves. The reporters continued to try to gather and find new information, more enticing information, to gather readers to their paper from their competitors. The desire to draw attention and to make them the one that readers should choose created the perfect environment for the narrative to sort of take a life of its own, and for reporters to take their own liberties with describing the situation. The reporting in both the penny papers and, to a lesser extent, the other papers of the time, drew a lot of attention to Helen Jewett's status as a prostitute, and in turn, they drew a lot of attention to what they described as almost the beauty of the scene of the crime. Much of the reporting described Helen as almost like a beautiful object, which is in sharp contrast to the actual details of the crime scene, in which Helen Jewett was said to have been attacked by an axe, with the bed she was laying on then accidentally catching fire from a candle, which is a far cry from a almost peaceful porcelain corpse. Not only did reporters take liberties in describing the scene of the crime, but they also quickly devolved into coming up with stories as to who Helen Jewett was before she moved to New York City. There were quite a few accounts of her life, of what her real name was, almost none of which were accurate in any way, shape, or form. In effect, the reporters fully sensationalized almost every aspect of Helen Jewett's murder. This created, like I said earlier, a feedback loop where the more sensationalized the events were, well, the more the public was interested. And, of course, this just took off. With that basic explanation of the events and of the reporting of Helen Jewett's murder, we can look at how, well, that's very similar to a lot of true crime reporting is nowadays. Much like the reporters of Helen Jewett's murder almost romanticized the scene of the crime and theorized over Helen Jewett's life and past and who the perpetrator was, all to keep public engagement. Modern-day true crime, YouTube channels, podcasters, even sometimes the official news media itself will sensationalize events to draw attention. They will, whether purposefully or accidentally, misrepresent things, leave out details to create a more engaging story. It seems that sensationalizing events of true crime is as old as true crime reporting is itself. One specific modern example of this that very much so reminds me of the way in which reporters romanticized and theorized and invented their own information is the case of the murder of Gabby Petito. Now, you might remember this. It was national news in 2021, near the beginning of COVID. So many people were super invested in, first, her disappearance, and then later, her murder. People across the country became so incredibly invested in solving the crime. They came up with their own theories, they tried their best to help find her, they tried their best to solve the crime once it was found out that she was murdered. Of course, throughout this entire time, there was a great deal of misinformation about not just her murder, but also about all of the events surrounding it. I can't help but see very close parallels between the way that Gabby Petito's murder was covered in national news and how the penny papers covered the murder of Helen Jewett. While the medium and scale of the two crimes and investigations was immensely different, they both still involved a great deal of what we would now call engagement baiting, where the people making the content in these examples, true crime reporters, will deliberately make their content and their writing and their publications as sensational as possible while still maintaining some semblance of plausibility. So this all goes to say that true crime reporting now is incredibly similar to true crime reporting when true crime reporting first began. It's always not just been about getting information out there, but it's very much largely about engaging the audience. true crime reporting has this element of sensationality almost inherently built into it. It's about events that generally people don't survive to tell the tale of. And the people reporting it, of course, want you to engage with their reporting. They want you to come back for more. They want to be entertaining and informative. Now, this whole podcast wasn't meant to denigrate the genre of true crime. Personally, I am a huge fan of a few channels that report exclusively on true crime. But this is to encourage you to take a look at how, even from the beginning, people reporting true crime sometimes have ulterior motives, and sometimes you do need to take a closer and more careful and considered look at what you're consuming. As the case of Helen Jewett, the reporters were just absolutely trying to get more engagement with their media, and in the case of Gabby Petito, people on the internet took the story as reported and ran with it their own way. Neither of these things make for accurate reporting. Since its beginning as a genre, or rather proto-genre in the case of Helen Jewett, true crime has been a hotbed for theories and sensationalized reporting. But it is also still reporting, it is still news, it is still something to learn about. So, I encourage you to, from here on, just keep that in the back of your mind. Remember how the reporters sensationalized Helen Jewett, remember how the internet sensationalized Gabby Petito, and always remember to think critically about the news you're consuming. I've been Totally a Real Historian. This is episode 1 of History Bites, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening.